We're going to start with chapter 32. Jacob wrestles with God. And where we end, that'll be a function of how the clock behaves itself. I'm convinced that chapters 32 and chapter 35 are the pinnacle of Jacob's life. We're going to talk about Jacob wrestling with God and then becoming, his name is going to be changed to Israel. And that's an interesting twist because the name literally means prevailed with God. And you can look at it two ways. When he wrestled with God, he prevailed over God. But when he lives for God, he's prevailing over the circumstances along with God. And so Israel is an interesting name. You'll also, as you go through your own reading, when you see him in his earthly personality, we'll talk about his personality, he's referred to as Jacob. And when you see him as a godly man, you'll see him referred to as Israel. So here we go. Jacob is on his way back from Haran. We've studied this map many, many times. And he's going to meet God at the river Jabbok, which means emptying. So we left off on this particular verse. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children. Now, I have that word 11 bolded because how many children did he have at that time? Benjamin wasn't born yet, okay? And so he had 11 sons, because if you had Benjamin also, he'd have 12. But he also had at least 1 daughter. So when you see 11 children and the 1 daughter's name, Dinah, so, the females took a tough rap in the Old Testament because, they mention Adam and his boys and they mention Seth and his boys. None of the girls are mentioned. Well, Dinah is specifically mentioned because of a specific episode associated with Dinah. And I gave a homework assignment last week. I said, let's try to figure out how old Dinah was when she was raped. And if the clock behaves itself, we'll get there. And if it doesn't behave itself, then you got a second week to figure it out. Okay? So he came with his 11 children, crossed the ford of the Jabbok. Now, the Jabbok River means emptying, and we saw where he emptied himself. He took 3 waves of bribes to his brother. He separated himself from his kids, and he did it the handmaids first, and then Laban, and then not Laban, but Leah and Rachel last. And he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. We're going to see that God had to change Jacob's name twice. Well, what do you mean, Job? It went from Jacob to Israel. Well, in chapter 32, he changes his name to Jacob, and he says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. But then a couple chapters later, he has to change his name to Israel again because Jacob hadn't emptied himself of, he emptied himself of all the stuff that was around him. But between 32 and 35, he's going to empty himself of the stuff that's within him. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man, we're going to ask 2 key questions in this passage. Who was that man and how did Jacob win? Okay. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, there's that word prevail, Israel did not prevail with Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, if one of your legs is out of joint, you're not going to be a very good wrestler. The last wrestling match my son-in-law Ben had was at the regionals his senior year, and what happened between junior and senior year, his foot was crushed. And I was in the bleachers, and I looked down on the sidelines, and these guys all warm up before the bout, and he's jumping rope on 1 foot. And I'm saying, oh, this is not going to be good. Well, he had a crushed foot, And he lost that match. He would have gone to the States again if he had won that match. But he lost that match to a kid that he pinned the first period the year before. So imagine your whole leg out of commission. Jacob was not in a real good position to win this match. Follow me. And then he said, let me go. This is the Lord speaking. Then I just gave away the answer to the who. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. So we have the who and the how. Now, that's a picture of my grandson, Jacob, wrestling with his coach. And I have taken a lot of video of my kids because I use it as a training tool. Keep in mind, Jacob is 52 pounds and the coach is over 200 pounds. And I'd show these films to my sons and to my grandsons, and we use them as training tools. And I'd stop the video and I'd say, look right there, that's an opportunity for wrist control. Or look right there, that's an opportunity for a crossface or something, right? So I'm showing this particular video to Jacob, and he's getting ready to to pin his coach. And Jacob says, stop, stop, stop. I stopped, and Jacob says, I don't think the coach was trying his hardest. I found that funny. I don't know about you. But here's Jacob wrestling with God. Was God trying his hardest? You say, well, God cheated. He blew his hip out of joint. We're going to continue on here. Okay, so the who and the how. And we have to look at Hosea to get the answer. In the womb, he grasped his brother's heel, and as a man, he struggled with God. Who did Jacob wrestle with? He wrestled with God. Now, the Bible doesn't say exactly how he won that match, but that verse is a great hint, and we're going to come back to that verse. So the first question was, who does he wrestle with? And he wrestled with God, and Hosea had to tell us this. And he struggled with the angel and overcame him. Now, a person could say, well, angel, that means it wasn't God. How many times in our study so far have we seen the phrase, the angel of the Lord, which was it was an appearance of Jesus before his incarnate as a baby. It was a theophany. Okay, so who did Jacob wrestle with? He wrestled with God. How did he win? We're going to come to that. How? Was it a half Nelson? Well, again, in wrestling, from the very youngest all the way up, that's probably the most effective pinning combination. But it's not going to work with God. Was it a headlock? We know that when you're younger in wrestling, it sometimes works, but after a while, it's only a desperation move. It doesn't work. Was it a cradle? A cradle is when you get the head and the leg and you crunch them and you put them there. But when you're little, you don't have the wingspan to do it, and you don't have the strength. But it does work when you're later on, especially if you're lanky. Now, if you were the coach and you were coaching the guy on top, I'm going to ask you this question. If you were the coach and you were coaching the guy on top, what would you shout to him right now? Right now, what would you shout to the guy on top? Break him down, right? Break him down, okay? So in the case of Jacob, who broke whom? There we have Moses. God broke down Moses, and it took him 40 years to do it. Not because God couldn't do it quicker, but because Moses needed that time. He spent from age 41 to age 80 on the backside of the desert. Here was a man that was educated in all the arts and sciences of Egypt. They said he was mighty in word and deed, and he had to be broken down. Here's another interesting person that had to be broken down. Now, Paul was broken down twice. First was Acts chapter 9. He was on his horse headed on over to Damascus. He got knocked down on the ground with a great light and a voice. And Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? He was also broken down in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Saul, the word means demanding. He was demanding. He demanded letters from the high priest, and he was also demanded. He was Mr. Popularity. And if you come Wednesday nights, we're going to talk about him owning the city of of Jerusalem. We're going to make a comparison with Jason Kelsey, who basically owns the city of Philadelphia, right? But God had to break him down again, and he gave him a thorn in the flesh. And the Bible says that he had such great revelation that he had to be given that thorn so that he would not be conceited. Some people try to say, well, Paul was healed. He was never healed, because if he were, and that were the reason for the thorn in the first place, then you'd see it finishing off his career being conceited. But no, God had to break down Moses. God had to break down Paul, and God had to break down Jacob. Say, well, again, how did he do that? And so now we're going to answer that question, how? It wasn't the half Nelson. It wasn't the headlock. It wasn't the cradle. I'm going to call it the heel lock. Now, I don't think you can pin somebody if you're grabbing a hold of that person's heel. But I've seen matches where a person has won in the last few seconds, holding on for dear life because they might be up by 1 point. And if that foot gets out of there, that's a point, and then it's tied, and then it's overtime. Okay? Look at that verse from Hosea. In the womb, he grasped his brother's heel, and as a man, he struggled with God. What kind of a hold did God have on God? Did Jacob have on God to win that match? Now, you can believe that if you want, but here's the real thing. He wept and begged for his favor. The half Nelson won't work with God. The headlock won't work with God. The cradle won't work with God. But I will tell you, you beg for his favor, and that will work. And that's what Jacob did. We don't know what he was physically doing. If you look at that picture of the angel's got the wrist control, which means all the angel had to do is let go, and he's gone. So it wasn't a wrist control kind of thing. He wept and begged for his favor. Continue on with Hosea. We'll be back in Genesis in a little bit. He found him at Bethel. We're going to find, as we study chapter 32, on his way up to Haran, he stopped at Luz departure. What he had done was he departed his dad and his brother and his mother. He was running for his life. He departed from Luz, and God met him there, the house of God. And we're going to see when we study chapter 35, God's going to change. I'm sorry, we're 32 still. God's going to change his name to Israel. And Jacob turns around and says, oh, by the way, what's your name? I think that's the beginning of chutzpah, right? He's wrestling with God Almighty. So, by the way, what's your name? Well, the name wasn't shown until Moses at the bush. But at Hosea, he was talking about an idolatrous generation. Who's your God? Who's your idol? Is it your boat? Is it your job? Is it your kids? Is it your wife? In this country, is it yourself? Who's your God? Your God is Jehovah. The Lord, Jehovah is his name. But you, and here's Hosea talking to the nation of Israel, and you must return to God. We're going to see that when we study. Remember the map? He goes up to Haran. He comes down to Padam Aram. He goes to Jabbok. He goes to Succoth. He'll go to Shechem, and ultimately he'll come back down to Bethel. He'll come back to the house of God. He's saying, return to your God. Keep in mind, Jacob is a picture of a person with 1 foot with the Lord and 1 foot with the world, and he's got to decide where he's going to be. And ultimately, in the course of these next 3 chapters, he chooses God. But you must return to your God, return to Bethel, maintain love and justice, and wait for your God always. Hosea is telling the nation of Israel, and the same message goes to Jacob, and the same message goes to you and me. return to God. So there's Jacob. He spent 20 plus years since his original visit to Bethel. There's no record of him sacrificing up in Haran or Param-Adam. There's no record. He's built pillars, a sign of his works, as opposed to a sign of a substitutionary sacrifice. When his wife turns out barren, instead of praying to God like his dad did, Isaac and Rebekah prayed 20 years for children. Instead of praying for his wife like she had a choice over being barren, he yells at her. He continually sought the things of this world. He put the world's priorities, and we're going to see that when we talk about the rape of Dinah. He put the property and the price and his prestige, all that in front of God. Jacob was afraid of everybody except God. He was afraid of Jacob. That's why he went up to Haran in the first place. He was afraid of Laban. That's why he ran away. And we're going to see that when he finally surrenders to God, the people will be afraid of him. And he ignored God's promises. God's promises were the same three that he gave to Abraham and he gave to Isaac. You're going to have as many kids as the sands of the sea. You're going to have plenty of real estate, and the nations will be blessed because of Jesus Christ. He ignored those things, and he tried to take all of the situations into his own hands. So Jacob, and I put myself up there, self-dependent rather than God-dependent. There's Jacob. He had street smarts. He survived and even thrived in a dog-eat-dog world. Remember, he said to Laban, he said, I'll take the striped sheep and you can have the white ones. And they said, no, let's do it the other way. And every time that they switched that thing back and forth, they said he changes the wages 10 times. God always gave him the best. He set out in his own wisdom. Now, this verse is very familiar. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. But I want you to look at this verse. And I highlighted Proverbs 28 because today's the 29th. And yesterday, and my habit is I read a chapter of Proverbs every day, and yesterday was the 28th. And so as I'm meditating on what we're going to teach, and I'm trying to keep my mind in the Word of God, that verse jumps out. And there you see, he set out in his own wisdom. And Proverbs 28 says, whoever trusts in his own mind is a fool. We use the phrase, let go and let God. So he hoped and he wished that things would work out his way. There used to be a bumper sticker. I don't know if it's still around. God is my co-pilot, right? Well, if God's your co-pilot, then you really don't have a co-pilot. Sometimes we'll make a decision and then we'll ask God to bless it. And that's what Jacob did. He made decisions and he said, oh God, by the way, is this okay? As opposed to what Hosea said, wait on the Lord always. Have him be your pilot, and you can be the passenger. Everything has been stripped away, Jabba, emptying. And we're going to see, we just started off the lesson today, that Jacob, that God stripped things away from Jacob on the exterior. But then Jacob, when he woke up, started stripping away. He took the action, started stripping away the interior. We'll get to that. Everything that he thought was his was in jeopardy. You know, Dobson one time said, if a dad is on his deathbed, he's not going to think, I wish I made that big sale. He's going to think, I wish I spent more time with my kids. So everything that Jacob thought was important got stripped away. Jacob's best plan, maybe Esau won't kill me. What did he do? He sent 3 waves of gifts. And last week we highlighted all the different camels and donkeys and sheep and everything else, sent them in 3 waves. He sets up his family where he puts those that were least important to him, the handmaids and their kids, and then Leah and her kids, and then finally Rachel and Joseph. And he says that maybe Jacob won't kill me. First, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 says, the promises in him, the promises in Christ are yes. Not maybe, not we'll see, they're yes. So Jacob says, let me go. God says, let me go. God wants to bless us and wrestle us to the point where he can bless. There are times when God can't bless me. If I'm in a rut, I'll just use the word sin. If I'm in sin, God can't bless me. In John chapter 9, where the blind man was healed, the Pharisees asked him, well, who was it that healed you? And he said, God does not listen to sinners. But one thing I do know, I once was blind, but now I see. In our study of Paul, we talked about he was a contemporary of Jesus. Was Paul there, John chapter 9? When Acts chapter 9, when he goes to Judah's house and Ananias lays his hands on him, was he thinking of that blind man who said, I once was blind, but now I see? God cannot bless us until we're right with him. You say, well, those patriarchs, they had breaches of faith, and Abraham went down to Israel, and they were polygamists. God didn't bless them because of those guys. He blessed them despite those guys. A parent cannot bless disobedience and rebellion. We each love our kids, and that relationship, parent-child relationship, will always be there. But the fellowship might not be there. I always use the example before we blacktop my driveway. I'd go up the gravel road, and the kids would hear that car coming over the gravel, and they knew, because mom said, wait till your father gets home. They knew there was a break in fellowship, but they're still my kids, and I still love them. If I'm in sin or I'm in compromise, God's going to wrestle with me. God's going to break me down. Hebrews chapter 12. He disciplines all those that he loves. And if you're not within discipline, you're illegitimate and you're not his son. If you think you can go out and live with the world and get away with it, then you better take inventory. Did I really receive Jesus into my heart, or am I just playing church? And we're going to get to that playing church stuff shortly. And he said to him, what is your name? And here's Jacob. We use the phrase, my life flashed before my eyes. If you're ever in a car accident or something like that, we use that phrase, my life flashed before my eyes. So here's the Lord, and he speaks to Jacob, and he says, what's your name? And Jacob may have been thinking about his poor blind dad, who says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. What's your name? He says, my name is Jacob. Again, my life flashed before my eyes. I've got 71 years and climbing, but that life can flash very, very quickly. What's your name? Heel catcher, trickster, deceiver, supplanter, liar. What's your name? It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And Jacob was there literally. They wrestled. They had man-to-man combat. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and then I'm going to come back. This is chapter 33. This is a scene where Jacob meets his brother. 20 plus years after his brother says, I'm going to kill him. And we read, I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. When God said, what's your name? And Jacob is having all this stuff flashing through, Is it possible that Jacob is thinking about Esau and what he had done to his brother Esau? He didn't have to trick his dad. He didn't have to rob the blessing. God already promised it. He was doing things in his own will, in his own wisdom. And so you see two things. You see in a time of judgment, and there's the Lord, and he says, what's your name? You could picture Jacob. He's going to be later on, Jacob's going to be with Esau. And he says, I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God. There's his brother. He knows his brother. And he's reminded that God gave Jacob mercy. You, Esau, have accepted me. Hosea again answers the question. The Lord is his name. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And Israel means prevailed with God. And I told you about the dual meaning. He prevailed against God and he prevails along with God. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why did you ask my name? It's a little bit gutsy, I thought. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Now, people have seen God face to face. People have seen Jesus. There's all kinds of human interaction. At the transfiguration, they saw Jesus glorified, but must not have been the full glory because Peter, James, and John lived. And Moses got to see the Lord, but he didn't get to see the front side. You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. So Moses got the full flash, but it was the backside. Jacob got face to face. He says, and he lived. The sun rose upon him, and he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Now, this is very, very common. You can Google earth, pinhead, sun, grapefruit, and you'll see all this math coming out. But if the earth is the size of a pinhead, that would make the sun the size of a grapefruit. But the grapefruit would be a quarter mile away from that pinhead. Now, the sun is a star, but other than the sun, the nearest star would be, if the earth is a pinhead, 8,000 miles away. And that's the nearest star. And unless you've lived under a rock, you know, the Hubble telescope and the Milky Way and all this stuff. The Lord is near. We talk about the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven. The first heaven is what we see right now. The second heaven is the stars when the sun goes down. But the third heaven is the heaven where God lives, the throne room of God. Paul said that he was caught up into the third heaven. But even though distance-wise, that's so far away, God is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. And then so Moses adds this. He says, to this day, we didn't eat that part because that's what happened to Jacob. So here we go, wrestles with God, but now Esau is coming up from the south, from the land of Seir. And we read, and Jacob, notice he's referred to as Jacob, not Israel. Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. And I've said from the start, Jacob was afraid of everybody else except God. And here comes Esau. He wasn't his big brother because they were twins, but he was burly. He was hairy. He was, the macho. Jacob, not so much. And not just Esau, but he comes with 400 men. So he divides up his children and drop down to verse 3. And he went on before them, bowing himself on the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. That's the ancient greeting that you give to a king. Now, keep in mind, the last time Esau spoke about Jacob, he said, I'm going to kill him. So we see this verse. He was bowed to as a king. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. God managed over those years. Well, you could say time heals all wounds. God managed over those years to take that hate out of his brother. And we're going to see when they met each other, they wept. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Who did the running? Esau went to Jacob. Jacob was still afraid. Jacob still hadn't honed in on the promises of God. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Now keep in mind, Jacob is a picture of the heavenlies and Esau is a picture of the earthlies. And when Esau was looking for a blessing from his dad, he was looking for earthly blessings. And we're going to see that when we start comparing gifts here. Then the servants drew near and the children, and they all bowed down. And likewise, their children drew near and bowed down. And last, Joseph and Rachel drew near. Keep in mind what Jacob did was he put his most precious farther away, just in case Esau and the 400 men didn't see with Jacob eye to eye. And Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" "They're the bribes," said he. Presented presents, you might as well call them bribes. And Jacob said, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough." And we're going to pay attention to that word enough. Keep in mind, Esau was earthly and Jacob was heavenly. "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like the seeing the face of God." We've talked about that. "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, because I have enough." Now, if you stop there, you'd say, okay, they're both well off. That's the end of it. But that's not the end of it, because the Hebrew word in verse 8 is different than the Hebrew word that's in verse 11. In the word in verse 8, that word is translated over and over and over again, a lot, plenty, a bunch. But in verse 11, it's translated all. And there's an example. I don't know if you can read all that. And the blue highlight is the verse that we're talking about now. Every time that verse got translated, except in the one we're talking about, it translates into all. In other words, you can have all the earthly blessings you want. You can have everything. But Jacob says, I've got it all. I've got all of that. Plus, I've got God. So they have their meeting and they're getting ready to depart. And we're going to see the personality of Jacob still not changed. Jacob's unspoken words as they depart. Jacob starts, he says, "Take these gifts." Unspoken, they'll bog him down. Esau says, "Come to my place. Let's travel together. Let's be buddies. Let's be brothers." Jacob says, "No, you go on ahead so I can make the great escape." Esau says, "Let me give you some of my 400 men to give you protection and help with those kids and all those beasts and everything." Esau wasn't traveling to be driving a herd. He was traveling with fighting men. Jacob says, "No, thank you. Are you kidding me? You're going to go south and I'm going to go west and north." So Esau is tricked again. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, which means hairy goat. They named the town after him. He was hairy. The word Edom means red, and he was hairy and he was red. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, which means tent or booth. And we're going to come back to that word house. I have 7 minutes. I don't think we're going to cover all of Dinah, but just bear with me. "And he built himself a house, and he made tents or booths for his livestock. And therefore the name of the place is called tent or booth, Succoth." And while we did dialogue or paraphrase, this is the one verse I want to hone my teeth into. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, he's talking to Esau, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me and at the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir. Well, Jacob, that human being, never got to go to Seir. And some people suggest that until I come is going to occur in Revelation chapter 12, when the Antichrist turns his back on Israel and Israel heads for the hills, Revelation chapter 12. And where Seir is, that's now the current place of Jordan, and that's where Petra is. And in Revelation 12, when they run, they're going to go to Seir. So he wrestles with God. He's emptied. He avoids his brother. He gives him the cold shoulder. He goes to Shechem. And we read, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padam Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, you call a female donkey a jenny. So what do you call a male donkey? A Hias? A Jack? Shechem's father. He bought for 100 pieces of money. Now, God promised him that he was going to give him that land. So here he is still in his own efforts, trying to fulfill the promises of God. He bought a piece of land and he pitched his tent. Now, when we start talking about Dinah, and that might actually fall into next week, gives you another week to think about it. He stops at Succoth, doesn't own the real estate, trying to get away from his brother, and he builds a house. He goes to Shechem, to a piece of real estate that he does own, and he plants a tent. My contention is he didn't build the house back at Succoth because he's going to stay there a while. He built the house for protection. So Esau goes south, brother goes north and west, and he arrives there safely. His brother's not chasing him anymore. And he erected an altar. Now, keep in mind, we've mentioned that through all those 20 plus years, he never did build an altar. He was good at building pillars. He was good in his own works, but he wasn't thinking about the substitutionary sacrifice. He builds an altar and he calls it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel. Now, keep in mind, there was no nation of Israel there. What he's saying is, this is my God. It's still self-centered. It's still self-dependent. But we're going to see, not in the next 4 minutes, we're going to see how God's going to strip all that away from him, and it's not going to be my God. He had the right idea, but the wrong location. God didn't tell him to go to Shechem. God told him go to Bethel. Now, I'll run through this very quickly, and then we're going to quit. The defilement of Dinah. How old was Dinah? The Bible says that she went out into the land of Shechem to be with the women of the land. Who would say that Dinah was in her 20s? Everybody's afraid to answer. Who would say Dinah was a teenager? Same thing. I get maybe a couple of guesses. Who would say Dinah was a preteen? Who would say Dinah was a little girl? If you just read, you're not going to get the answer. But let's go through it. How long was Laban together with Jacob? 20 years. 14 for the women and 6 for the animals. How long before Jacob married Leah? Those 7 years. So, that being the case, if the first sexual relations was after 7 years, here come the list of brothers that are coming out. Year 8, year 9, year 10, year 11. You say, well, it only takes 9 months. Maybe it's 8 3/4 years. Let's cut Leah a break. Let's say they're not Irish twins, if you will. So you read Judah, she has that 4th son, and then she ceased bearing. So then, right there, we're already up to year 11, okay? Then you have the daughters of the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, and then we have Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Year 16. Now, if it was 20 years that he spent with Laban, when she left, she was 4. Which leads us with the question, well, okay, so how much time did he spend in Succoth before he went to Shechem? But now we have her up to 4 years old. 4 to 6 years if we go to a baby every 9 months instead of a baby every 12. 4 to 6 years old. Now, things seem to move pretty quickly at that point. We see Laban catches up to a matter of 7 days. We see Jacob wrestles with God. We see Jacob meets with his brother Esau, and they meet. It doesn't say they had a big old party for years. They just met and they went their separate ways. And then we see Esau returned that day on his own way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Succoth. Did he stay a while, or did he stay for protection? That's the question, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to go a little bit over here. So Jacob came safely and he pitched his tent. I commented about his tent on his own real estate as opposed to a house on nobody's real estate. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. King James says goes to see the daughters of the land. Now I'm on borrowed time because it's 9:45. Goes to see the daughters of the land. So what is that word in Hebrew? It's always translated daughter. Except up there in the beginning of chapter 34. It's always translated daughter. Now, down the street from me, my daughter lives, and she's in her 30s. And she has 4 daughters, 1 adult, 4 daughters, preteen, all the way down to a baby. You can't say daughter suggests age, because I've got you now from 30 down to 1. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. King James translates that word defile, and it's the same word that used when they talk about defiling the temple. Some people suggested it was consensual. No, it was not consensual. She was raped. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved, ESV translates that word, young woman. But the word is girl. And the ESV, right there, this thing's not behaving itself too well. Right there is that same word, but some English teachers said don't use the same word more than once in a sentence, so they came up with a different word. She was a girl. Now, how old was this girl? That same word is translated in Zechariah, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in the street. Now, ladies, I don't know anything about your childhood, but at a certain age, playing in the street does not sound like a fun thing to do. And it's probably before you were a teenager. Get this girl for my wife. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with the livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. The next point I want to make is the way Jacob reacted to that thing, but we're already 2 minutes over. I'm going to suggest to you, and we're going to see a word that's translated from infant to adolescent. That was the age of Dinah. My daughter was raped when she was 21, and I was furious. Jacob's daughter was raped as a preteen, and he had to think about it.